proper name. And of course, the political process attempts to do just the opposite. It attempts to lie and obfuscate about everything. So when we think about why this is and why this happens and why we put up with it every 4 years, we have to think about propaganda, which is really the lubrication that the state uses to keep us all sort of appeased. And I wanted to start with talking about the man who literally wrote the book. A fascinating man, and I'm curious to wonder how many people in this room have heard of Edward Bernays? Okay, quite a few hands. Now, some of you may have been at an event in Dallas we had a few years ago, and I mentioned him briefly there, but he's an absolutely fascinating character. And his personal story is something else. But the reason I pulled this quote out of his book, people used to title books a little bit more honestly. They didn't have the subtitles that go on and on, you see them in the airport. But nonetheless, he just called his book Propaganda. And for many, many years, that was the term used for advertising. Advertising is sort of a 20th century term to make things sound a little better. But this quote of his, where he talks about an invisible government and the people who really set public opinion, I thought he's foreshadowing what we call the deep state today. He absolutely foreshadowed it. And of course, the deep state is not just people within the regulatory state. It's also the nexus of people in NGOs and media and academia, etc. But I thought that was such a fascinating quote. So there's actually some parallels between Edward Bernays' life and Ludwig von Mises, both born in Austria, or Mises, what is now Austria. So Edward Bernays was born in Vienna in 1891. Brilliant man. Absolutely brilliant man. And you've ever heard the phrase, sometimes the most effective people are the people you've never heard of? Well, this guy's one of them. So he's born in 1891 in Vienna, moves to New York City as a young boy. He proceeds to live until 1995, an astonishing 103 years. And so his first job as a young man, or one of his first jobs when he got into the advertising business, was in working for the Woodrow Wilson administration around the time of World War I. So they set up something Orwellian sounding called the Committee on Public Information, which you can imagine what that was. And so what it was an attempt to gin up support for the war effort. Because at the time, something like 60% of Americans had at least some degree of German ancestry, and going to war with their first cousins was not necessarily their number one priority in life. So we needed some support for this. So he went to work creating wartime propaganda in the 1910s, and after the war was over, he actually attended the Paris Peace Conference. And a big takeaway from the Paris Peace Conference from Mr. Bernays was that, we now need to turn to the problems of peace. That's what he called it, the problems of peace. And one of those problems was to disseminate American propaganda worldwide now. Talk about American accomplishments. And one of the other peculiar problems of peace is selling stuff. Because at the end of the day, he's an ad man. He's an advertising man. That's his job, whether he's selling war or whether he's selling dish soap. So he came up with an idea for a tobacco company. Because in the 1910s, there was still a stigma attached to women smoking. That was viewed as something women who were a little more disreputable, women who were harlots might do. They shouldn't really smoke cigarettes, kind of a dirty male habit. Well, the problem with that is you're only selling cigarettes to half the population. Right? That's a big untapped market. This won't do. So he made a proposal to the Lucky Strike Cigarette Company, and they paid him the whopping sum of $25,000 at the time to come up with an ad campaign. And his idea was to call cigarettes torches of freedom. And he went and got one of his own employees, a woman named Bertha Hunt. That's a very 1910s name. We don't have too many Berthas anymore. Bertha Hunt, so he had her walk out into the March 1929 Easter Parade in New York City. So he had her walk out in this parade, and she lit up a cigarette. And as she walked through the parade, some other women came out also smoking. And these were somewhat glamorous women, in the period. And so instantly, because this event was a big public event in New York City, instantly millions of women around the country heard about this and started rethinking their thoughts about smoking. And as a result, tobacco sales to women rose considerably over the next couple decades. So it was actually successful. And so what's so interesting about this is he was learning as he went through all this, and he said, human customs, things that have been long-standing traditions, can actually be broken down by using dramatic appeal. And having glamorous, well-dressed women smoking in a fancy New York City parade was the use of dramatic appeal. And so what he understood and developed was the idea of engineering consent. We have to appeal to people's underlying motivations. What really gets them on a more visceral level. And his understanding of this was something that he crafted and thought about technically, but there's some people who just get this naturally. And we all know what we're talking about in the political sphere here, right? Why does Bill Clinton win? Why did Bill Clinton win? Why does AOC resonate with people as opposed to Elizabeth Warren or Hillary? Why do some people have that emotional touch? Why does nobody want to vote for John Kasich? Well, it's because he didn't read and understand Edward Bernays. He didn't understand how you engineer consent. And so I think we're going to find out that Edward Bernays' legacy lives on well past his life. And he's a fascinating guy. This is a slim volume. If any of you have interest in picking up, I recommend it. If any of you can find this first edition with the Noam Chomsky cover, you might want to hold on to that one. So how do you engineer consent? How did Edward Bernays and how do our modern political media class go about it? Well, George Orwell understood this as well. He wrote this fantastic essay in the 1940s called Politics in the English Language. And in this essay, which you should all read, it's very brief, it's available online, it's just maybe a couple thousand words, he talked about the use of meaningless words. And by meaningless words, he means words that are just used so vaguely that you can craft them in a consciously dishonest way. And I love that term, consciously dishonest, because maybe it's subconsciously dishonest, but nonetheless dishonest. And he even back then in the 1940s said, well, a word like democracy, there's no agreed definition, and it's just so vague. We just understand democracy as, well, that's something good. That's all democracy means. You don't have to define it much beyond that. So